Hello everyone, hope everyone is doing alright and staying safe. What we're going to be reviewing here today is we're going to be looking a little more in depth into the recipe costing that we have been doing in our class, as well as culinary applications. Most of you are pretty familiar with this already, and for those of you who have competed or will be competing in the Pro Start competition in your state or in the state of Kansas, you're pretty familiar with this as well, as for it's a part of the competition itself. What we're going to be looking at today is just simply how to take a recipe, the basics of how to cost out that recipe, and then how to use that to then figure out how much a single portion of a recipe costs, as well as how that can be used to price food on your menu. Just a little heads up, this lesson is going to be more so the basics of recipe costing. We are not going to really be going into edible portion versus as purchased portion with produce and certain items. We're just looking at the basics here, as well as looking at more straightforward, simple recipes here. Also, a couple of steps what we're going to do here are going to be a little bit different from what you would do in the Pro Start competition. This is more geared towards just kind of a simplified version of just kind of introducing and reviewing recipe costing, as well as to kind of give you kind of a baseline to work with if you're costing out food from home, like a home recipe. Like I said, we'll talk a little bit more of that as we get into it. Okay, so the goals that we have for today is we're going to review just simply how to cost out a recipe, as well as how to figure out just the cost of a single portion, as well as going over some basic vocabulary here. We're also going to be looking into what food cost percentage is and how that can be used to create a menu price for your restaurant or for your establishment, or just simply if you want to sell something. And lastly, my goal is that by the end of this, you should be able to take a recipe, not only that I will give you at the end of this video to kind of practice with, but also that you should be able to take a recipe of your own, whether it be a personal recipe or a family recipe, and then figure out the cost of that. Okay, so the example we're going to be going over here today is actually the recipe we would have done in class. So here, as you can see, I have two recipes. One is on the left is for a egg pasta, and the one on the right is the filling for the pasta. In fact, you can kind of see in the recipe for the filling, you have the recipe for the pasta, which is right here. Both of these are accessed through SeriousEats.com. I would highly recommend that website if you are interested in either keeping yourself busy, if you want to look a little more into the science and chemistry of food, or just simply if you want a really reliable recipe that has been tested by chefs, as well as people that have advanced scientific knowledge of food, of ingredients, that have put their recipes out there. Both of these websites, or both of these recipes, come from that website. Again, the website is SeriousEats.com. Okay, so a couple things with recipe costing, just to kind of make your calculations a little easier. In this video, I'm going to be going over a couple of what are my preferences when it comes to food costing and recipe costing. You may choose to do things a little bit differently, but I'm just going to kind of go through my preferences, as well as kind of explain the best I can of why I want to go with those preferences. So the first thing, just to make things a little bit easier, is try whenever you can to cost based upon the weight of ingredients, or in some cases, if you have to, the count of ingredient. For example, 1 lemon, 3 eggs, things like that. But whenever you can, go with weight. As you can see, the recipes I have here, they both start with weight. 10 ounces of flour, 20 ounces of ricotta cheese. They do give a volume measurement, but sometimes that can be really tricky, especially if you have to, as you'll see when we try to figure out unit cost, it's much more tricky to try to figure out unit cost based upon a volumetric measurement. There are exceptions. We will have some of those exceptions here in this lesson, but for the most part, try to go with weight. The example I give, especially when you do go into produce and certain food items, finding like a recipe that says like 2 cups of onions, to try to calculate that for food cost is very, very challenging, very difficult, because if you've ever seen a recipe that says like 2 cups of onions or 1 cup of tomatoes chopped, you don't know, unless if you actually do it and measure it yourself, how many cups one onion will get or how many cups a certain produce item will get. So try to go with weight if you can. Good advice that I can give you is be pessimistic in your calculations. For example, here in like the amount of servings, recipes sometimes will say serves 4 to 6. Always go, or at least I always choose to be pessimistic and say it'll feed the least number of people, because at least this way, when you're pessimistic, whether it's like rounding up or here in this case choosing the lowest amount of servings, it's always better to kind of prepare for the worst, so to speak, and end up making a little more money or a little extra than you anticipated, or kind of covering yourself just in case like something goes wrong with the recipe. It's always better to be a little pessimistic and just have things turn out a little bit better than say like you're going to serve 6 people and your recipe actually turns out to only feed 5, which case you could lose money or you can actually make less of a profit than you anticipated. So that's my recommendation. Also, just whenever you are doing a recipe that is dealing with a lot of produce, things that need trimming or preparation, such as meat, vegetables, fruits, things like that, make sure you are factoring in as purchased versus edible portion. For this lesson, we're going to be focusing more on basics here. So we're actually not going to tackle this too much today. We'll save that for another time, but just keep in mind you do have to keep this in mind. For example, a pound of whole chicken does not translate to a whole pound in your recipe after like trimming off like fat, bone, anything else that you need to do. Okay, and finally, we will also go a little bit more into Q factor. So very small amounts, such as like here you can see the 1/4 of a teaspoon, can be written off as your Q factor rather than you having to take the time to calculate, the small amounts there. Okay. Before you get started, just make sure you understand how many servings your recipe feeds. Here in this case, like I said, we're just going to be working with 4 servings. Okay. All right. So if you have been in culinary applications or have done anything with ProStart, or just have in your classes done any recipe costing, this sheet or this grid should look fairly familiar to you. You have the different columns that kind of help you organize everything to eventually get to your ingredient cost. Here we have the ingredients from this recipe just thrown over here along with their ingredient amounts. Okay. So just a couple things, just to be clear about what each of these columns mean. The ingredient and the amount needed are fairly self-explanatory. Purchase unit is basically the size of the container, the package, or the count of the item that you purchase. For example, like flour in the grocery store for the home cook, you would normally buy, say, a 5-pound bag of flour. So the purchase unit would be 5 pounds. For industrial, you'll probably really more be purchasing 25 pound. Then in that case, your purchase unit is 25 pounds. If you're buying in produce for, say, a big restaurant, you'd be ordering them from your distributor or your supplier in 10-pound cases, or you can buy frying oil in giant like jugs. I can't recall how big the containers of oil are, but you kind of get my drift here. Purchase cost is basically how much that package will cost you. So to kind of go with our example with the 25-pound bag of flour, if a 25-pound bag of flour costs $6.48, then your purchase cost is going to be $6.48. Okay, the unit cost. If you've ever been at the grocery store and you see the price tag, and then up in like the corner, like in orange, is like a little unit cost or the little number, that is the unit cost. Basically, it tells you how much that ingredient costs per a single unit of something. For example, the price per 1 ounce of milk, the price per 1 pound of meat, the price per a single lemon, a single egg, and so on. What we're going to be doing is, that's going to be our first calculation, where we have to find the unit cost and then use the amount needed in your recipe to find the ingredient cost. Amount needed is pretty self-explanatory. That's just basically how much you need in your recipe. And then the ingredient cost is basically what we're trying to find here, first of all, is just basically how much it costs you to have flour in your recipe, how much it costs you to have eggs in that recipe, how much it costs you to have everything else in your recipe. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone over all that stuff, let's go ahead and actually go through the steps. So the first step here is you need to find the purchase costs and the purchase unit of your ingredients. So just for our demonstration here, we're just going to go with things that you would see in most grocery stores, whether it be like a Walmart, a Dillon's, Aldi's, even like a Costco, Sam's Club. We're not really going to look into like food distributors like Cisco or US Foods, just because the grocery stores, usually you can find these sort of prices and stuff easier online. Just again, this is kind of more of a basic recipe costing lesson for the home cook, as well as if you're kind of doing something with culinary applications and arts. Okay, so for step one, you got to find the purchase cost and purchase units. So what we're going to do is a 25-pound bag of flour. Again, we kind of went over through this example here. A 25-pound bag of flour costs you $6.48. So we're going to put both of those in these columns. For eggs, say we buy in bulk here, 60 eggs costs us $3.30. So again, we're just going through each of the columns here. And once we fill all this out, we then can go on to our next step. So you can kind of see, I've gone through each of these ingredients, figured how much it would cost per 1 unit of something, the package of something, and then put their prices right next to it. Okay, step 2 is you're going to be filling out the unit cost column. So what that is, as we said, it's the price per 1 unit of something. So for example, what we're going to do is to find the unit cost, you need to take the purchase cost and divide it by the purchase unit. So in our case, first thing you would want to do is take $6.48 and divide it by 25 pounds. However, just one thing you need to keep in mind is you need to keep the amount needed unit of measurement in mind. So for example, in our amount needed, as you can see, it's in ounces. If we were to find the unit cost and divide it by, divide $6.48 divided by 25 pounds, we'd find the unit cost per pound, which is completely okay. It just then makes your calculations much, much harder when you're trying to multiply it by 10 ounces. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to take 25 pounds and convert it into ounces. So there's 16 ounces in a pound. 25 times 16 gets us 400. So this 25-pound bag of flour is 400 ounces. So we're taking $6.48, dividing it by 400. And then that gets us our unit cost. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to be doing things a little bit different here to just kind of show you what, if you are competing in ProStart, what it will look like versus if you were, say, doing this at home. In a restaurant and in the ProStart competition, you really need to be detail-oriented. So as you can see, we go to the nearest tenth of a cent, or the 1,000th decimal place. Whereas like for a home cook, you can go around to the nearest cent. For most of the demonstration and lesson here today, we are going to be working with the simplified version here. But I do want to point this out that you will probably see this whether you are competing or just running a establishment of your own, because you want to make sure you account for every single penny. Okay, so either way, you take $6.48, you take the purchase cost divided by the purchase unit, and that's what you get here. Okay, and we do that for each ingredient here. So $3.30 for the eggs divided by 16 eggs gets us about 6 cents an egg, or 5.5 cents an egg. For the salt, we're taking $2.28, dividing it by 48 ounces. We get 5 cents per ounce. Now notice how I'm keeping the label here for 2 cents per ounce, 6 cents per egg, 5 cents per ounce. That's super important as we go through here and as we go into our next step. So I'm just going to go through each of the ingredients and find the unit cost for each one. Now, in some cases with produce, you may have a recipe that calls for a volumetric measurement. Well, you have a couple options here. What you can do if, say, you're cooking at home is, if you're going to be purchasing a whole lemon anyway, you may want to just find out the cost per a single lemon. However, for the most accurate measurement here, you do need to know, if you're doing, say, a recipe in bulk, or if you're doing catering, you need to know how much a certain produce item yields. So you can either do that yourself, like take a lemon, squeeze it, measure out how much it is. There's a great book out there called The Book of Yields that kind of lays out the yield of all different produce items. Or, a simple web search can also kind of give you a ballpark. So 1 lemon gives us about 6 teaspoons of juice. So if we were, say, making this for a large group, we would want to make sure we're not over ordering on lemons. So we can also take this and instead take 52 cents divided by 6 teaspoons and get 9 cents a teaspoon of juice. And then we can then multiply later, but we'll get into that in a sec. Okay, but like I said, we're not going to go too much into produce items today, just because we do run into complications like this. But just kind of be aware that certain produce items you will need to be basing your food costs on what they yield versus how much or what you get when you purchase them. Okay, so we go through again, continue with pepper and olive oil. Okay, once we have everything here for our unit cost, we then go into our third step, which is the ingredient cost. So what we do is we simply take the unit cost, here in this case 2 cents per ounce, and multiply it by the amount needed in your recipe. Now, super important here, as I said before, make sure your units of measurement are the same when you multiply. So for example, here we made sure that we are multiplying 2 cents per ounce with ounces. If you took $6.48 and divided it by 25 pounds and found the unit cost per pound, you can't just multiply that by then 10 ounces because your unit of measurements are off. You need to make sure that these are the same. Okay. Now, if we were to do this for ProStart, we would take our longer number here, a longer decimal, to the thousandth place, and take 16 thousandths of a dollar and multiply it by 10 ounces, and that would get us 16 cents. But again, just for the sake of our example here for the home cook, we're just going to take this unit of measurement, 2 cents per ounce, times 10 ounces. That gets us 20 cents. So the cost of flour in our recipe is 20 cents. Okay, we go into our next ingredient. 6 cents an egg times 6 eggs gets us 36 cents. So just to put the eggs in our recipe costs us 36 cents. Now, this is where Q factor kind of comes into play here. Sometimes you'll have amounts in your recipe that are so small that calculating them would would yield you such a low ingredient cost. It's either not worth the effort to calculate it all the way through, or give you such a low amount that it's almost negligible. Now, you can absolutely take a package like this and figure out how many teaspoons or how many cups are in that container. In fact, our ProStart team actually did take the time and do this, where we took 1,133 servings divided by 4, and we found how many teaspoons were in the package. So our purchase unit, we put the number of teaspoons and then divided it by, took $2.28, divided it by that, and got a unit cost per teaspoon. However, in hindsight, that was very unnecessary. You don't need to go that far. Okay. So we would write that off as our Q factor. Basically, the amount is so small, it's almost negligible here. Okay, so we would just put Q factor and then just move on from there. We'll go a little bit more on what Q factor is exactly in a few moments. Okay, for regatta, 12 cents an ounce times 5 ounces, get 60 cents. 29 cents for 4 ounces of Parmesan cheese, costs us 60 cents for the Parmesan. Nutmeg, again, we have such a small amount here, we would just write that off as a Q factor. Here with the lemon, you can see why, even though it's only 2 teaspoons, we're not just writing that off. It's worth putting the 18 cents here. However, with pepper, it's negligible. For the olive oil, if you're just drizzling olive oil over the pasta, you could probably make a measurement for that. We're saying about an ounce here. So 22 cents times 1 ounce gets us 22 cents for the cost of the extra virgin olive oil. Okay, so now that we got the ingredient costs here, we can go then to our next step here. Okay, so we're going to move this over to the side, and we're going to go to step 4. So now that you have the cost of each ingredient in your recipe, you're then going to add these up to find the subtotal amount of your recipe. So what we're doing is we're taking every amount here, 20 cents, 36 cents, 60 cents, 60 cents, and so on, and we're multiplying that or adding that together to get a subtotal. Now, for the Q factor, we're just omitting that. We're skipping that for right now. We'll get to that in a second. But if we added all these up, we would get a subtotal cost of $2.16. Now we get to our Q factor, step 5. Now, Q factor is basically a markup you need to put on your recipe for small amounts of ingredients, spices, any extra items that you put on the plate, whether it be garnish, any complimentary items that you give out that you don't really charge a customer for, whether it's like bread and butter on the table, or ketchup, or mustard, or just some basic supplies such as like plastic wrap, gloves, things that you need to pay for in the preparation and service of a food item, but you don't really charge the customer directly for. You still need to factor that in for your costs, but it's not a direct cost in your recipe. Q factors can have a wide range from 0%. The highest generally is 10% for, say, like a fine dining establishment, but that's kind of more up to you. There's some establishments that do go above 10%, but that's their choice, and just you kind of need to you just need to customize this based upon your experience and what you need to do. For the ProStart competition, they go with 1%, and what that is the percentage we're going to work with for our examples here. But let's say, for example, just for a moment, that we worked with a 10% Q factor. So what we would do is we would calculate 10% of our subtotal. So we would take $2.16 and multiply that by 1/10 or 10/100ths, which would be 10%. So our Q factor would be, and again, if we were to go, like say with ProStar and go to the third decimal place, we would see we would have 216 thousandths of a dollar. Okay. If we were to say go with 5%, we would take the subtotal amount, multiply it by 0.05 or 5/100ths, which is 5% as a decimal, and we would get about 10 cents or 108 thousandths of a dollar. But for the sake of our example here, and again, if you were competing in ProStart, you would go with 1%. So we would multiply $2.16 by 0.01 or 1/100ths, and that would get us, again, if we were going with ProStart, we'd say that is 22 thousandths of a dollar. Or if you want to simplify it, that would be 2 cents. Okay, for step 6, what you would then do is you would then take the subtotal amount and add in your Q factor. In our case, we're just going to simplify it and go with 2 cents. So the total recipe cost is about $2.18. And that is our total recipe cost. That is what making this recipe as a whole is going to cost us. Now, to find the portion cost, we figured the number of portions here and from the recipe before. We're then going to, for the last step here to find the portion cost, is we're going to take the total recipe cost and divide it by how many portions there are. So in this case, we're taking $2.18, dividing it by 4, and we get a grand total of 55 cents. So to make a single portion of ravioli would cost about 55 cents in our example here. Okay. Now, you then go to your final step, which is how much do you price this item at? Now, what you would charge a customer for your first particular item is dependent on so many different factors. It's dependent on the market that you're in. It depends on how much effort and time was taken in making a certain food item. Depends on if you are a fine dining establishment or if you're more casual dining. It depends on so many different things. So just do keep this in mind. We're just going to go, again, based upon the ProStart model of a 33% food cost. But again, keep in mind this is not a final menu price. We're just going to talk about how you would use food cost to kind of get a ballpark for a menu cost. So for what you're going to do here is you're going to take the portion cost, which we determine as 55 cents. And you're going to, if you're, say, pricing it at 33% food cost, what you're going to do is you're going to take your portion cost and divide it by your food cost percentage, in this case, 33%. And when we do that, we would get around $1.65. So going by the ProStart model, you would charge about $1.65. However, that's where we get to our actual menu price. You most of the time would not put $1.65 on your menu. You most likely would, say for example, put it as $2 to make things nice and easy. Again, this is just kind of a baseline for what you would do and what a lot of restaurants do to come up with a menu price. But this price is so dependent on the many different factors we talked about with your business or their circumstances, as well as your labor costs and everything. If this amount does seem a little bit low, like, hey, a plate of ravioli seems really, really cheap for $2, I'm not going to charge somebody $2. Well, keep in mind the recipe that we just costed was just for the ravioli itself. It didn't include anything else. Okay, so hopefully this gives you kind of a better idea of how we figure out a menu price, or how businesses kind of come to a menu price here. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Okay, so if we go to our second example here, say we build upon what we did in the previous example with just the ravioli, and we go into a completed dish. So here we're adding another component here. We're adding the sauce. We'll add the cheese and garnish a little bit later here. So what we're going to do here is the same exact thing that we did for the ravioli, where we're going to list out all the ingredients. We're going to list out the purchase unit, purchase cost, and the amounts needed. Now on the right here is the recipe that we're going to use. Again, another recipe by Serious Eats. It's a tomato sauce recipe. And we're just going to take this and put this into our grid, looking up the prices, and we're going to go and fill this out the exact same that we just did before. Okay, so what we're going to do is, again, same thing as before. We're going to take our purchase cost divided by our purchase unit and get 22 cents per ounce, and go through each of the ingredients and just figure out the cost per ounce, or the unit cost for each ingredient. Now, in some cases where you see that there is a volumetric measurement in your recipe, and you see that it's not small, or it's not small enough for you to write off as your Q factor, like say for example our oregano here, 1 teaspoon, that's too small for us to really quantify, so we just would write that off as Q factor. 3 tablespoons, however, is a large enough amount in your recipe that you would want to properly cost that out. So in these cases where you purchase an item by weight, however your amount needed is in volume, what you can do is you can figure out how many tablespoons or how many cups are in that particular package. So here to the right we have the nutrition facts for a 6-ounce can of tomato paste. And here, just looking at the top, what we can do is we can figure out how many tablespoons about that are in a 6-ounce can of tomato paste. So we take 5 servings, with 2 tablespoons being counted as a serving size, and we figure that there are 10 tablespoons in our unit cost. So what we can do is we can take 42 cents divided by 10 tablespoons and get the cost of 4 cents per tablespoons. That way when we multiply by our amount needed, we can just go tablespoon to tablespoon here, and we take in a weight measurement and turn it into a volumetric measurement. Okay, so if we keep on going, we go to our whole canned tomatoes, 6 cents per ounce. Now, in some cases where a recipe calls for kind of a count or a volumetric measurement, but the item that you can purchase is only sold by weight, and sometimes it can be a little hard to gauge how many ounces, say, a sprig is, because a lot of times if we take this particular example of basil, we see a package like this in the grocery store where a bunch of herbs are packaged into this little plastic jewel case sort of container. We can't really see or make out how many sprigs there are in a container. In this case, we have a small enough quantity that we can just write this off as our Q factor. If the recipe was large enough, then most likely what you would need to do is you would need to take the time and actually weigh out what a sprig is. You would need to take the time and figure out how many sprigs are in a container. So what I would do here, like let's say for example, this recipe instead of needing 1 sprig had like 20 sprigs, and I could only purchase my basil in containers like this. What I would do is I'd purchase a container like this, open it up, count how many sprigs of basil there are actually in this container, and then for my purchase unit, instead of writing half an ounce, which is what this container is, it's half an ounce, I would instead write 3 sprigs, cost $1.98. Okay, in this particular case, it's small enough that we can write it off as Q factor, but just keeping that in mind if you deal with, costing a produce item like this. Okay, again, another reason why costing out produce and edible portion versus as purchased portion is much more difficult, and why we're not really diving into that today. Okay, continue going with our salt and our butter. And after we have our unit cost, we're just going to multiply straight across here. So for the olive oil, we have, now keep in mind here, I have 2 tablespoons, but I'm not multiplying ounces with tablespoons. I'm taking 22 cents per ounce and multiplying it by 1 ounce. Be careful there. 5 cents a clove for 4 cloves of garlic gets 20 cents. Red pepper, just a small amount, would be our Q factor. Oregano, again, just a teaspoon, Q factor. Tomato paste, 4 cents a tablespoon for 3 tablespoons, 12 cents. Our canned tomatoes for 48 ounces costs $2.88. Basil is already written off. Kosher salt, small enough that we would write that off. And then butter, we have our 38 cents. So again, now that we got our ingredient cost, we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to move this to the side, and we're just going to add up the ingredient costs. So again, just omitting the Q factors here, we would get a subtotal of about $3.80 for this recipe. We would then multiply this subtotal by 1% and get 4 cents. Now, if you multiplied $3.80 by 0.01, you would get 0.038. In our case, again, if you are doing this for ProStart, you would write out 0.038 cents. For our case, just for simplification here, we're just going to round that up to 4 cents here. So then we add these two together, the subtotal and the Q factor total. Again, $3.84. We can make about 10 servings for our sauce. So we take $3.84, divide it by 10, and we get 38 cents. So one portion of this tomato sauce costs us 38 cents. So now, when we actually go to figure out the cost of the final dish here, like you would do for a restaurant or in ProStart, normally a dish is going to consist of many different components. In the case of our ravioli, we have the ravioli pasta itself, we've got the tomato sauce, we've got the cheese on top, we've got parsley, we've got garnishes. We have a few things. In the ProStart competition, when you make a dish, you're not going to have just one single recipe in your dish. You're probably going to have 2, 3, maybe even more components of your dish. So if you're competing in ProStart, you would work with a sheet that looks just like this, where you would list each component, say for example the ravioli, tomato sauce, cheese, garnish, and just go down the list and write out the cost of each portion, then do the menu price. So that's what we're going to do here. Okay, so to find the cost of the dish, what you're going to do is you're going to take the cost of each portion of each component and add that together. So in case of our ravioli, we're going to add 55 cents to the tomato sauce, which we just calculated. And we're then going to do the same thing we did before with the cheese and garnish. Now in the cheese and garnish case, we can kind of skip a few steps here because we're just going to do this per portion. This is per individual portion. So for our mozzarella cheese, we can purchase in a 1-pound block for $3.58. It's 22 cents per ounce, and it costs us 44 cents to serve with 2 ounces of cheese. Now that's pretty generous. It's quite a bit, but again, we're just kind of being generous and pessimistic here for our calculations. And then for our parsley, we'd use so little of it, we can put that as our Q factor. Go through our subtotal, multiply by 1%, find the recipe cost. So to garnish the plate would cost us 45 cents to garnish the plate. Sometimes you will see that the garnish or certain components on the dish actually cost more than your main ingredient. Sometimes that's the case. So now to find the cost of the dish, you just then take each of these ingredients and you just list them out. Now, just simply add the components of the dish together to find your menu cost or your menu price. So we would take 55 cents plus 38 cents plus 45 cents to get $1.38. So to put a plate of ravioli in front of a customer would cost you about $1.38. So to figure out kind of a ballpark on where to price this at a 33% food cost, we would take $1.38, divide it by 33%, and get $4.14. Now, obviously on a menu, you would not post it as $4.14. You would just probably round it off as $5. Again, if that does seem low, just keep in mind that there's many different factors involved with costing out a recipe or costing out and then putting that price on the menu. In our case here, if you are taking the time or you're having your cooks take the time and make their own ravioli, make their own pasta, make their own sauce, you would probably be able to charge a premium. You'd be able to, upcharge this by quite a bit. If you were kind of more in a casual sort of place, say for example you weren't making the ravioli but rather buying it in, and you got but you still got around the same plate portion cost, then yeah, you could probably look a little closer to $5-10 around that range. Okay, so now that we've gone through two examples, what I'm going to challenge you here to do is try this example on your own. Okay, if you are part of the culinary arts class, this recipe kind of looks familiar. If you are outside of our culinary arts class, what I'd like you to try is do the exact steps that we just did in taking the purchase cost, dividing it by the purchase unit, finding the unit cost, multiplying that by the amount needed, get the ingredient cost, and ultimately go through all the steps that you would take to get to the final menu price and your portion cost. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you pause here. You can pause the video if you would like. Just take the time to write this out, figure it out, and then once you have your total amount, you can then unpause the video and see if you're in the ballpark. Okay, so let's go over what you should have about. So take a moment right now, take a look what your cost is per unit, cost per ingredient, okay? And then for the subtotal and the recipe cost and portion cost, take a look and make sure you are close. And then see if your menu price is around the same. Okay. If you made a mistake somewhere, what you should do is go through each step here, see if your amounts are the same. If they are not, then you made a small error just in that section, so you can kind of go back, see where you went wrong, and then fix and make corrections. Okay. Well, I hope you found this video helpful. My challenge now for you is to take a family recipe, preferably a more simple recipe, and cost out that recipe for both the total recipe cost and the portion cost, as well as what you would charge on a menu if you were selling this recipe at a restaurant or a business of your own. Okay, well, I hope you found this video helpful. Hope you guys are staying safe. Make sure to keep washing your hands, and I will see you later.